The Democratic Republic of Congo says it's suspending cobalt exports for 4 months to rein in oversupply of the battery metal on the international market. Now, roughly the size of Western Europe, the war-riven country, the DRC, is endowed with vast mineral wealth, including the world's largest reserves of cobalt and coltan, both critical to the production of electronics. Now, the M23 rebel group has reportedly seized several lucrative mining regions in the east, forcing mass displacement and disrupting the critical minerals trade. Joining me is Pronk, a research analyst at Project Blue. Carl, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Well, let's just start with the broader picture here for those of us that need an understanding on this. Could you walk us through the key minerals found in the conflict zone of the DRC? What are their primary uses, and why are they so crucial to global industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So the DRC is known to be housed to a vast variety of critical materials in the world. And within the eastern region of the DRC, there's quite a notable few. Of course, there are larger markets more towards the south. The copper industry along the copper belt is a big market, about in the millions of tons. But when you start going to go north, you encounter tin, tungsten, cobalt as well. And you can also encounter tantalum. Now, all of these materials, with barring tungsten, find a lot of use in the electronic sector, but for different reasons. The material that has the most impact from the DRC would be tantalum. It's quite essential for modern day capacitors used in smartphones or any minor circuit boards in the world that require a very dense, high energy, dense capacitor in a small area. Sorry, tantalum is used in capacitors and it's also used in semiconductors as well. And it's picked up a lot of light recently, ever since 2020 when the pandemic happened, when portable electronic consumption and demand increased substantially due to work from home policies.
And I want to get into that a little later in the interview, but given the long history of instability in the DRC, how have businesses adapted their supply chain strategies to continue operating in such a volatile environment? Are there unique models, for example, of resilience that stand out for you?
So businesses have had a challenge in adapting to the DRC and how it's run. And I think that's true for most markets in the world where it comes to any of them quite particularly. But one major thing in the DRC is that verifiable sources of material is quite prominent. Of course, government legislation, specifically one in 2010, the US's Dodd-Frank Act was enacted to ensure that US companies were responsibly sourcing material, and that they were ensuring that their material was at least conflict-free and that they knew where it was coming from. Of course, this has helped in the short term, and it has continued to help today. The European Union has their own version of something similar to the Dodd-Frank Act, and so has China. But there are systems such as MineSpider, which use the blockchain system to register the material onto the markets. And the blockchain is really effective. It can note the material, and once it's on this blockchain, it cannot be moved unless someone with a key goes in and edits it. So material coming out of a registered mine or a registered refinery will be noted where it's going to and where it comes from.
Now, Kyle, tantalum plays a crucial role, and you touched on this in modern electronics, particularly semiconductors, AI development. With the ongoing geopolitical tensions, especially around Taiwan and global chip supply, do you foresee any long-term shifts in tantalum sourcing or alternative materials emerging?
Yeah, so for tantalum, it's a little bit more tricky than a lot of other metals. It's such a small market relative to the larger giants such as iron, chromium as well, and even manganese. It's only a 2,500 ton market in retrospect to the millions of tons of other markets. So sourcing the material is quite difficult. Setting up a large scale mine is even more difficult, and having the long-term sustainability to set up these large operations results in a problem. So tantalum, as a result, comes out as a byproduct of other metals. Historically, it was mostly tin. So whenever a tin operation was producing, tantalum would come out as a byproduct of that. Nowadays, it seems like there's been a shift towards a lithium byproduct. Tin is still there, but the expansion of lithium mining in the world, specifically hard rock assets, produces an alternative source for tantalum. The Greenbushes mine in Australia is a really good example. It historically has produced tantalum, and with lithium being the new material that's extremely ramped up in production over the past few years, tantalum can come out as a byproduct of that metal.
Kyle, as I understand it, tantalum would be the one to worry about in terms of supply chain disruption. All right.
So tantalum, where it's sourced from in the world, is heavily concentrated in the DRC. Most of tantalum production does come out of the northern region in the DRC. So when movements and disruptions on the supply chain occur within a small region, it can notably affect the markets. Although there are alternative sources in the short term that can ramp up to meet demand, it might not necessarily be the long-term solution, as these markets require they require higher costs to get tantalum out. So you need to have a long-term sustainable solution, and simply asking existing producers to get tantalum out as well is not necessarily a long-term solution.
Carl, from an economic perspective, how much of a challenge is the informal and artisanal mining sector in the DRC? I mean, would formalizing these operations be a viable option?
So when it comes to challenges in the DRC, formalization might be the direction to take, simply because it integrates these operations into the global market rather than trying to suppress them. These artisanal mines and small scale mines have great impact on the local communities, and removing them might actually do more harm than it could do good. Of course, that's not for me to, not by my expertise, but formalization is a really good direction to be able to take. Admittedly, it is a complex direction, and it is one that can take years. Rwanda has formalized their tungsten industry, and doing so has allowed for better worker health, better worker bargaining power when it comes to weekend work days or hours worked in general, and safer conditions. So the general challenges to combat them probably would be a direction of formalization, simply to integrate these smaller markets into the larger global scale.
Yeah, I suppose following on from that, I mean, cobalt and other critical minerals are being scrutinized for their ethical and environmental implications. I mean, leading to innovations in battery chemistry to reduce reliance on them. Could we see a similar shift happening with tin and tantalum, or are they too essential to replace in the near future?
So soldering really relies on tin for most modern day electronics. It's a good material that has good tensile strength and and a good melting point as well for the temperatures. So tin is unlikely to be replaced in the short term, or at least there aren't any known new technologies. Alternatives exist, of course, for the most part. The issue comes in is, are these alternatives going to sacrifice too much? And the same thing can be said with tantalum, is that, well, there are other capacitors, but when you get miniaturization occurring in smartphones, you need a higher density for a smaller area. And tantalum is at this point the best material that can do so. Alloys can exist, and other combinations of materials can be made if we can find them and find the technology. But replacing these two metals might be a little bit more challenging than simply finding an alternative to tungsten, for instance.
Then there's this humanitarian angle, and I know that's not your expertise because you really do the research analytics on supply chains and so forth. But there have been increasing concerns that, you know, the illicitly mined materials, particularly tin, tantalum, tungsten, are being mixed with officially sourced minerals before they leave the DRC. To what extent is this happening, and how effective are current efforts to sort of track it down?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's a question that's going to be asked a lot more. It's unfortunately not an easy one to answer, because if we knew the answer to it, we would raise red flags even more so than we already do. But I think a more appropriate direction would be to ask, we should probably be introducing more legislation that can provide more oversight into these markets, to not make them as opaque as they are today. Other industries can be quite open about their resources and their production volumes, but for tantalum production and for other minor metals, this is simply not the case. So having additional eyes, I think, is quite a benefit to increasing the awareness, and simply adds that layer of, okay, if everyone's looking at it, we can now see where things are moving to and going.
Yeah, and I just want to end off perhaps with an extension of that. You know, when you're dealing with mining, I think the end game for many is that the people living around there have some sort of benefit to the resources being extracted. Um, Realistically, I mean, whether it's governments and corporations, what can be done to ensure that communities can benefit without causing any? I mean, it's a hard question, but I suppose everyone in the value chain has to think about it at some point.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think everyone in the value chain needs to identify and eventually meet at a table of some sort and propose solutions that can be effective at integrating these operations. Again, I mentioned formalization, and that might be the most appropriate in this market simply because of the impact that it has on these smaller communities. Completely removing them is not necessarily going to yield also positive results. So it definitely needs to bring industry, government, and policymakers to the table to identify a potential solution, such as formalization, which could help the communities.
Well, Carl Pronk, a research analyst at Project Blue, speaking to us from Stellenbosch in South Africa. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Devan. Appreciate it.